Break after this session, and after the break, just to put it in your head, we're actually doing pretty good on time. I think we're only about 5 minutes off, so good work so far. But we're going to come back at 11:35 sharp after this next talk. Next up, we have Kurt Schuringer. Kurt is the principal spatial computing solutions architect for AWS. He recently joined AWS after, I think, almost 12 years at Lockheed Martin. Very impressive guy. I got to spend some time with him yesterday, and he is going to talk more about how we scale an enterprise, and I think more from a kind of a deeper tech side. So welcome Kurt to the stage, please.
Thanks, man. All right, thank you, Brad. Let's get this going. All right. So I realize I'm standing between you and your next break. So we'll make it about 40 minutes for this one. Just kidding, don't go anywhere. So this is a topic I'm very passionate about. Yes, I am very new at Amazon AWS. I've had a lot of experience over the last 12 years from where I came from deploying advanced visualization solutions. As part of this, I've had a 40-man team that we use to stand up both products that we bought from vendors, in-house products, right? We've kind of done it all between business development, manufacturing, sustainment. And so what today I wanted to go over a little bit about is my personal experiences, the trials and tribulations that we went through as part of this. And the big piece of this, right, is how do we scale? And we've heard a lot about scalability. And from what I've learned, there are three main pillars that you've heard about a little bit, but that I have personally experienced. The first one, right, is, again, the psychology of the users. It's how do we find a product that our users want to use? The second is the ROI and business case, right? It is how does our business make or save money? And those two areas we've heard a lot on presentations the last 2 days. What I would like to cover today is the technical side of things. The technical side is, this is the old presentation. Keep going. So the technical side of this is covered in three main aspects. As part of this, the three main topics that we're going to be going on the technical is one, what is the organizational evolution that we're going to need in order to implement and scale these types of solutions? The second one relates to what are the technical capabilities, the reference architectures, and then the third one is what are the risks that we're looking at as part of the first and second piece. And so today there's a lot of content. I put this in a form of a thought experiment. There we go. And what that means is if you can take away one or two things today, hopefully more, that'll help you scale, that'll be a win for me. And as part of this, right, we're going to talk a lot about the what's. The hows is going to be about the unique makeup of your organization. And today we don't have enough time to talk about really in the how. Those can be done later with workshops. But there's going to be a lot of what's that you may not have even thought about. Now the why. Y'all are here already. We don't really have to talk about the why. But as you see, these solutions that we see out on the show floor and the exhibit, they are becoming more and more affordable. More affordable than they were, even just a couple years ago. We're seeing that our employees are constantly buying these solutions now, headsets, software, pipelines, bringing them in, right? We have all these solutions, all these different licensing terms and agreements that we'll have to work with. So how do we help now consolidate a bit and scale those out? So let's talk about our first what. The first what is going to be advanced visualization. So what is advanced visualization, right? It's not just XR, right? That's what we heard a lot about. But it's also putting, if you're a shoe company, putting a 3D web viewer of your shoe out on your website, whether it's for internal or external. It's simulation. That can be computational fluid dynamics. It can be other types of simulations. It can be a rendered video that you make for marketing, right, as part of a marketing video, but you still need a pipeline and a way to track your assets behind the scenes. So all of this, when we talk about today of the what and how to make it happen, really covers that full spectrum. Now, on the enterprise side of things, what we're really targeting today is deploying to your own employees. Right? Yes, there's a piece of if you're a vendor or you're delivering this to your customer, right? But those have other barriers and red tapes to them. But this information is still equally important even to those vendors to see what types of things that you can help your customers out with when they need to scale up. So the first thing I'm going to ask is who in here, and I'm going to ask anyone that's an IT or cybersecurity person to stand up. Hopefully we have somebody in the room. Okay. These are the folks that you need to give kudos to, provide free hugs, appreciation, gifts, shower them, because these are the folks that are going to make it happen, right? These are the folks that are going to bring it to the next level, because a lot of times visualization solutions, they start on a small development team, or they start on a business team, whether on a manufacturing floor. And a lot of times they do involve security and IT as part of that, but only to the point of just submitting a ticket, right? They're kind of the afterthought. Hey, submit this ticket, get it done, put it through the pipeline. And what we're going to see is how important their role is to try to bring to the forefront to really get this going. So what are some of the things that IT and security generally take care of, right? We look at bandwidth and latency, whatever your network upgrades might be, right? We might scale vertically, increase our bandwidth pipelines to our sites. Then we start looking at horizontal scaling. How do we introduce cloud, 5G, edge compute, even go maybe to Wi-Fi solutions? And then lastly, device management. Device management is not just device management, but it's also the security aspects of that, the encryptions, everything that we need usually from an IT security team, and are really not possible usually, or on a very small scale when you're working on a development team. So now when we get to the development team side, what do we look at? Now we all say platform agnostic, right, multi-platform, but what I mean in this case is you have to look at it from a resource perspective. You have, or a lot of your company employees already have PCs and mobile devices on their desk and in their hand, right? It is much easier when you're introducing a whole pipeline, a 3D pipeline, which includes the software, the threads, the hardware, to use what's already on their desk. Now, by no means do I say, discard XR. Those need to be worked in parallel, but it's much easier sometimes to get started when you have smaller stepping stones. So make sure to take into account that to make it easier on your users, right, and that goes a little bit more in the adoption side of things, to start with something small, and you're not taxing your IT teams as much by saying, hey, we need these new products out right out of the gate. A little bit on the development team side, what you see, you have your digital threads. This is taking the data now from existing data systems for how we're going to feed this into your visualization pipeline. This is very important. A lot of teams sometimes skip over this fact, and we'll cover this here in a second. But this then leads to data standards. This is the data standard of not only standardizing data coming out of those data systems, whether they're going out or in, but the actual data stored in your visualization system. If you're storing data in those systems in a way that in all different formats, potentially proprietary, you're going to have a much harder time, especially if you're a large enterprise business, communicating with your different business areas, your customers, your vendors, especially if you have to start sending these assets back and forth. And finally, make versus buy. I've been on the side where I've bought products as a whole, implemented them, made them. You're probably going to land somewhere in between, but you need to also figure that out sooner than later and map out your requirements as part of your architecture. And finally, the last buzzword I'm going to use, just because I feel it's obligatory to put on this slide, the metaverse. Today, though, we're not going to talk about the metaverse and what it is. We're going to talk about how we get it done, right? And it's not just the metaverse. The metaverse is really all of these things really combined, right? It's a super app. It's a super app that runs that you can collaborate in, right? Whatever your definition of it is. But it really boils down to how you make that work on the underlying thread. And there's one more term and moniker that I've kind of come up with that help make all this happen. And I call it development visualization operations. We know DevOps, we know DevSecOps that deal with security, and all of those things really relate to how do we iterate and push out these solutions to our end users, right? We iterate as quickly as we can. As we come up with new upgrades, we push those out. But a lot of times the visualization and the unique aspects of visualization get forgotten. That's everything from how big our data is to the vertical and horizontal scaling that we need. We may not see in a lot of other solutions that have been pushed out before this time. So the rest of the day, everything I talk about really focus around that topic of how do we start looking at a dev visops environment. So let's look at this from a different picture, right? We start on the left-hand side where we're prototyping. A lot of teams start small, right? It's somewhere on the manufacturing floor, or you're out in the field, or you're somewhere else in business development or marketing, and you're trying to do your technology R&D. You're quickly figuring out, right, what we need to do. At this point, you start getting towards piloting and you start going from a crawl quicker to a walk, right? You're getting a lot of pull. These things are still novel. So we're trying to figure out now, how do we keep going? And roughly around the time where we get piloting to small scale deployment, we hit a snag. And the snag is you're starting to scale and you can't because of many different reasons, whether that's you're deploying an XR device and IT doesn't have the resources for you. You're going from a sandbox to a production environment, which has its own problems, right? From a security point of view, it was no problem getting into your sandbox, but now you're in production, and this is a whole different animal. And the snag becomes larger and larger as you start going from small scale to large scale, where if you don't get your IT and security teams involved, which we'll see here in a second, you're going to fall flat. And you're not going to be able to scale. When I say scale, I usually mean up to about 50 devices, sometimes 100 depending on your enterprise. Large scale, you're starting to talk about thousands, if not tens of thousands of devices within your organization. Now that can relate to whether it still be a PC or an XR deployment. Either way, there's still software and pipelines that are going along the way. Now, one thing that I have on here that I won't be talking too much about, but is very important, right? And this brings that first pillar that we talked about with end user acceptance and adoption, is your change management processes. Do you make sure that you have all the training pieces in place? And not just training for your software, but for the devices you are deploying, right? How do you turn on your HoloLens? How do you turn on your Magic Leap? What happens if you can't log in? These are the things that also need to be figured out. Because if you're managing this also as a small development team, and I've been there, I managed from when I was at Lockheed Martin about 100 devices, you get away from actually building to just doing end user support because you didn't get the right IT and security folks involved at the right times. So what does this look like now when we do an overlay? We see on the right-hand side, you have your organizational solutions. Everything in green is really what IT and security should really be taken care of usually. On the left-hand side, you have your individual teams working on this. So as part of this, there's a transition trench that happens there. As part of this trench, what that means is we have this baton, we're in this race, we have the torch, and we're about to hand it off. We submit the ticket to have everything go, and the torch drops. Nobody's there to pick it up. It's sitting in some IT queue, and the reason for that is you did not engage your IT and security early enough. You didn't give them enough hugs. You didn't shower them with enough gifts. It's all about, from day one, making sure they're part of the solution. IT is just as excited about this as you are. So if you involve them from the very beginning, they have a sense of ownership, a sense of responsibility to it, and you'd be amazed once you get to that small scale deployment, they will want to prioritize your task because they are involved and excited about it. And the more that you can start pushing these down, and what I mean by pushing it down is even when you're doing your technology R&D, your make versus buys, make sure that you get them involved so they can have a say. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be the end-all be-all. There will still be some roadblocks along the way, but they will help make sure that you get them cleared. The last part of this is kind of management, and we won't talk too much about that, but you need to make sure that you have sponsors as part of this, both in IT and otherwise. And when I say sponsors, I'm not just talking about sponsors who say, yeah, this is cool. I'm talking about sponsors that will support you, reprioritize their tasks, and give you money when needed to help clear roadblocks. If you can do all those things, you're going to help reduce this transition trench to as small as possible. So when you do get to that small scale deploy, you're not managing devices as a small team. You're not helping or figuring out how do we scale our network infrastructure when that's really not even your job. So those are some things when we look at organization and a little bit of risk behind that, some of the things that you can do. And just make friends with your IT folks, they will appreciate it. So now we're going to get a little bit into architectural considerations. What this means is reference architectures, the capabilities behind them, and some of the risks that we see as we start scaling out when it comes to really the technical side of things. So here is a reference architecture that's pretty common. This is one approach to it. You can have several different tweaks. And on the top right-hand side, you have your external data systems, whether these be your PLM engineering systems that your CAD is stored, your manufacturing systems, your ERP systems, MRO, sustainment, right? These are all your field systems or field support. This is where your data is coming in primarily. And you want to make sure, right, that you have a good connection to these systems. On the left-hand side and towards the bottom, you have your visualization data systems. This stores your data. You have your data authoring, which you get all your data out of the other systems and kind of put it together into an XR scene, or again, if we're talking about a shoe company, right, the model with the product data behind it. A lot of these probably should be going over some data bus, right, some way of how to interface with these systems. And a lot of times these are forgotten, right? And the data bus is going to be holding a lot of data as part of this. You're thinking about terabytes of data potentially when you start scaling out to thousands of users. Then you go to the next level down, which is your visualizer services. These are your rendering engines, whether you're doing, again, cloud rendering, post-processing with videos, or even just a client that's running on your end user devices. And then finally on the bottom is your use cases, your products, right? What are you delivering as part of that use case solution? And then finally your interfaces. Your interfaces are your touch points with your end users, whether they be an AR/VR device, a computer, a scanning device, not just things that receive, but can also input back to these master systems. And obviously everything's right connected all through these different layers. So when we start looking at scalability, there's several things at each one of these that you want to take a look at. Now today we won't have time to cover each one of these, so I'll kind of pick out my important ones, but you'll kind of see a list of some of the bigger ones that I have encountered. The first one is your agnostic content manager, right? And we say, sure, agnostic, right? Again, you really want to make sure that the data being stored in these systems is non-proprietary. The problem that we have seen, especially from where I came from, is a lot of systems still either have a proprietary format or at least non-standardized. And that poses a big problem for a couple different reasons. One, if you want to get the data back out because you need to send it to a customer, you need to send it to another business area, a vendor, and they're not using the same visualization solutions or tools that you are, whether you bought them or made them, if they're not in some format that's at least human readable, we're talking XML files, JSON files for metadata, or at least GLTF, FBX files for the binary 3D data side of the house, it's going to be a big problem for ingestion, especially if you can't even get it out of these systems. The last one on that one is obsolescence. What if these systems go away or you decide it's no longer fits the need of your business, right? You want to make sure that you're not putting data into a system that you can no longer get back out. And a lot of times when teams look at solutions, they don't look at a lot of these aspects. They just see the top level, right? Ooh, it fits my business logic. Hey, this is a great work instruction system that meets my needs. You really need to look at the core and how these are done in some of the future use cases. Otherwise, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot when time comes. The other thing is the open data interfaces. You want to make sure as early as possible when you're doing architecture development with your IT, you identify the needs of what systems you need to talk to, how much data you're going to be pulling, and when you need it by. A lot of times when you hit that small scale or piloting small scale, you start going to IT, it's like, hey, I need to pull a terabyte worth of data out of your PLM system. This happened at my time at Lockheed. Thank God we tried this in the sandbox, and the whole system crashed, right? It was something that IT was like, yeah, we've got it handled. This is something that you need to make sure, and you'll see it as a risk actually on the next slide, that you set up as early as possible and you define the parameters and the requirements ahead of time of what you're going to be doing. Going to the next level, we start looking at system interoperability. What this means is you might have a different visualizer than you have from your data system or your content authoring system. You want to make sure that they can talk as much as possible because that gives you the most flexibility. You want to make sure it's model-based, meaning you have a single source of truth as much as possible. You don't want to create a second data system that now you're making new data and it's completely segregated from some of your other systems. As much as you can flow that thread through is going to be most optimal. And generally, this starts going into what we call the open architecture approach. The other thing is, as much as plug-and-play services, we've already seen some of the vendors here, right? They offer plug-and-play. The more you can do it where it works interoperable with some of the solutions you already have, the better it's going to be both now, but also, again, if you ever decide to switch or go to something else. And finally, the last thing that we'll talk about is, on the bottom row, is modular user features. Now, we're lucky because a lot of the vendors here, right, they have strong workflows. You can customize it. You can have your standard processes in there that you either use for manufacturing or that you use for the field. If you're making the software, you might want to look at libraries that they work for you today. An example I gave is object recognition and alignment. But you want to make sure that it works for you today, but you can quickly rip that out and put something else in if you need to later on. If you fix yourself to some of these more upfront and you don't make yourself flexible, it's going to be very difficult as you go down this path and you're several years in, and now you have to do major rework. So the last slide I'm going to show is what are the risks now associated as going down this pipeline with implementing these capabilities. From the top-hand side, again, we talked about the large system pools that we're going to be doing. If those systems are not optimized, load balanced, data warehoused, you're going to bring those systems down overnight very easily. I've run into that personally many times. The other one, right, is that digital thread. We talked again about those open interfaces, making sure you have standardized processes and tools. On the next level, you want to start looking at how do we make sure we don't lock ourselves into like a whole ecosystem. Now, I'm not saying that you don't use one of these systems, but make sure you really define your requirements up front, because what I found is a lot of teams rush to a solution, they rush to a vendor. Yes, they're great because they provide the whole all-in-one solution, but then you see somewhere else, hey, I really like that authoring system. I really like that component of that system, can I use it? And right now, a lot of times the answer is no, they're not compatible. Now, part of this is going to be getting the market, the industry, the vendors to start making it a little bit more open architecture. If you're making the product, this is something you can control more, but it's something that we can start pushing these requirements back to the vendors to say, hey, I'd really like to use this other one. I want to use the rest of your system, but give me some open standards where I can start mixing and matching different products. For the vendors, it's going to ensure that they provide a sale nonetheless, and then guys and everybody else implementing, and for your end users, it's going to provide the greatest flexibility. We're going to see areas where you start getting low bandwidth, where you need, you see low bandwidth, high latency. That's where you start doing your network upgrades. We talked about 5G, the edge, different upgrades there, but that's going to be important to do at all of your sites that you start deploying this to. And quickly, you're going to see that a lot of these sites, IT, because they don't have your requirements, has only scaled that infrastructure enough to handle their current workload and maybe a little bit more. So please work with them ahead of time to make sure these are scaled, because you don't want to flip the switch overnight and then you bring all of these sites. You also want to look at the density of your content, right? You can talk about polygon counts when you talk about 3D content. We can talk about sheer size. So one program that I worked with at Lockheed Martin, one package that we used for the field that was for training field services was about 40 to 60 gigabytes large, and that would have to go to each individual user. Now, imagine you have thousands of users. Not only do you have a network problem, you might have other problems such as, your end user device may not have the compute to be able to store or even process this type of data. So you want to look at maybe a solution like remote rendering. It's not the end-all be-all, but it is a possible solution, right? There are many that probably will come over time, but it's something that you already want to think about when you do start having these large pieces of data. And finally, the last one that you'll start seeing is we're starting to see a lot of web-based apps. That seems to be where the future is going. So you want to make sure that as part of these web-based apps that you make them available. And if you have a client application now sometimes you can't get away just because of certain devices, that you can go cloud virtualization. There are solutions out there that allow you to take an existing client application and turn it into essentially a web-based app. Now that may not be a good native solution, but at least it's a good band-aid, right, if you encounter this risk to get you to the next hump where you can start looking at a native web solution. The last one I really want to talk about is the large quantity of device deployment. I've mentioned this now a few times. Very quickly, you will ramp up, especially when we're talking about the XR devices, where you go from 5 devices, 10 devices, 50, 100. I manage for my group about 100 devices. And I will personally say this is because of my lesson learned of we just submitted the ticket. I had a good relationship with my cybersecurity team, but not with my IT team. And what ended up happening is, they approved it to go on our network. They did some of the MDM policy management fine, but they didn't do any of the end user support, meaning I had to set up the devices. That takes 30 to 45 minutes depending on the device when you do all the login authentication, setting up MDM, setting up your users, installing your applications. Those are all things that take time. And once it's in their hands, right, if they encounter a problem, there's a troubleshooting issue, who are they going to call? Well, if IT's not involved and it's not in their system and it's not in their MO to handle right now, it's going to be on your development team, which takes away from innovating, building, putting out better products and use cases. So please, the moral of this story for today is 2 things. Get your IT and security teams involved as part of your organizational evolution, right? Very from the beginning. Again, pamper them, whatever you need to do. And the second piece, again, is look at some of these technology areas that you think that you can garner and put into your system. Again, I'm not asking you to do all of these. If you can even find 1 or 2 to say, hey, I've not thought about that, that's something that you want to look at as part of moving forward and implementing to make your solution scalable. That's all done now with that Dev visops focus that we said. That brings us to kind of the end. There is one Q&A I think I already saw on one, and I got to see how much time we have. Oh, I think we're out of time. I'm going to answer this one question real fast. If you have time, I'll be here for the rest of the conference. You can help answer. The one that was in the Q&A in the app talked about shardless server infrastructure, if that is needed for scaling. Shardless basically means, you don't have session-based. It's more what you think about for the metaverse. Really, in the enterprise, you have only edge cases where you're probably going to have hundreds or thousands of users in the same open world scenario. Chances are you're probably not going to need that right away to scale. More than likely, you're going to need some type of infrastructure at some point that supports more instant micro sessions, which is just quickly one or two people interacting, maybe a few extra people, and you have a lot of those going on, especially when you start looking at metaverse in the XR world more so than VR. So that answers that question. I appreciate your time today. I know we're out of time for the break, and I don't want to take up more of your time, but like I said, I'll be here the rest of the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Great job. Okay, we're taking a break. We are starting at 11:35 sharp.